His view of it is these so-called stakeholders, most of whom don't actually have any real skin in the game. Well, it ranged from celebrities writing letters and people doing podcasts to judicial.
Politicians and their advisors have got to get a bit sort of serious about this and stop acting as just commentators. They are the government. They hold the powers of the state. They can legislate. They can change all of these things if they wish.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast, this special briefing episode we're bringing to you today in between the normal weekly editions of our weekly pod. Today I'm joined by our Head of Lifestyle Economics, Dr. Christopher Snowdon, and our new Director General, Lord Frost. Welcome both. The reason we're here today to discuss the stakeholder state. This is something that has been brought up, something that we've approached, Chris, you've written about for years and years in many guises, but it's been brought back up to the agenda through a couple of news stories and pieces from not least Keir Starmer's former Director of Strategy, who's been complaining about it. Chris, I wonder if you could start by just giving us a bit of an overview of what is meant by the term the stakeholder state.
Well, according to Paul Ovenden, who's that advisor you mentioned, the stakeholder state is a large coalition, really, of people who stop things getting done in this country. So Paul is one of many people who've left government in recent years complaining that it's just impossible to get past these obstacles from... In Paul's view, not so much the civil service, actually. That's where he differs with Dominic Cummings. He doesn't think the civil service is a problem. In fact, he says that the civil servants would like to tear down the stakeholder state more than anybody. We can maybe discuss that in a second. But his view of it is these so-called stakeholders, most of whom don't actually have any real skin in the game, it ranged from celebrities writing letters and people doing podcasts to judicial reviews, endless litigation, and that kind of thing. And there is definitely an element of truth in that. MPs have been complaining about judicial reviews for decades. It is certainly the case that you need a huge amount of paperwork to get anything done. And even after that, there will be appeals and appeals and appeals. My view is just that rather than moaning about celebrities writing letters and normal parts of the democratic process or vested interests, campaigning or lobbying, which they have every right to do, if the government thinks these things are a problem, and if there's constant litigation in particular, you just need to change the law. Do the one thing that politicians can do that none of these people can, they are literally lawmakers, change the law. The problem is we have just so many laws built up over a very long period of time, particularly with the Blair and post-Blair, which are then admittedly gold-plated by activist judges. But you can't blame the activist judges. They are apparently within their rights to do this. Blame the poorly drafted, albeit well-meaning legislation. And that is why I think really the big challenge for this government and any government that follows is going to be repeal, or amend, actually, more realistically. I think a lot of this stuff doesn't need to be repealed, but it needs to be amended so you bind the hands of activist judges more tightly and you stop these NGOs and campaign groups being able to lodge these endless judicial reviews and legal reviews.
Yeah, one of the lines that Paul Ovenden used was describing a state that has got bigger and bigger while simultaneously and systematically emasculating itself. So this sense of you've built up all these laws but also quangos and commissioners and everything, and rules about consultations and whatnot that restrict your own action. David, you've obviously spent a long time in government. What is your experience of it and take on it?
Well, it's a very recognisable picture, and I think it is for anybody who's been in government, particularly if you're doing kind of domestic reform of any kind. You do face this sort of coalition of people who have an interest, and they get in the way. And I had to laugh really when I read Ovenden's article because the Labour Party, this is a political point, okay, but when we were in government, the Labour Party did everything it could to mobilise the stakeholder state, to mobilise judges, to mobilise quangos, to mobilise NGOs, to oppose what the government was trying to do and dig it in procedural messes, for example, over the Rwanda plan and immigration and all of that. And all of a sudden, they get into government and it's like, we didn't realise any of this was happening. Isn't it shocking? And I think politicians and their advisors have got to get a bit sort of serious about this and stop acting as just commentators. They are the government. They hold the powers of the state. They can legislate. They can change all of these things if they wish. It's been convenient for whatever reason not to do that or to blame others. And there's no doubt that a future reforming government has got to get to grips with all of this. I am a little sceptical about the idea that the civil service is a bunch of frustrated can-do people who just want to be taken off the leash and allow things to happen. There definitely are good and frustrated people in the civil service. A lot of them leave, of course, rather than keep fighting this. I do think the civil service is part of the problem because they've come to be guardians of process and propriety rather than of making things happen. And you just can't have that with an effective government.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a tension that is at the root of this that is sort of between quote unquote independence, so independent regulators or independent bodies? Think about things like not just regulators, but people like the Children's Commissioner or the Victims Commissioner, for example, who are set up by the government as independent voices to sort of approve legislation or have their takes on legislation versus basically democratic control? Or do you think there needs to be a bit of a swing back from outsourcing to democracy, basically?
I think there needs to be a swing back to democracy. And all of these organisations have often been set up for political reasons, due to political pressure for something in the news that we've probably long forgotten about. And this is just classic public choice theory, really. You know, the bureaucracy will expand and try and get as much money for itself. And to do that, it will need to constantly present a crisis and say, actually, things have got worse since we were established, and we need more money to tackle this and more staff to tackle this. You look at something like the Food Standards Agency, which is always the classic example I use, which was just formed as a result of a series of stories in the press about restaurants being infested with rats and so on. And before you know it, they're going around running campaigns telling people not to drink too much when they're watching the World Cup. You know, these organisations got bigger and bigger and bigger, and they look for new dragons to slay, and they then lobby for more legislation for them to enforce. And so it goes on and on and on. So there needs to be 100%, Callum, there needs to be a defunding of NGOs, politically active NGOs, and there needs to be a genuine bonfire of the quangos, which is such a cliche. People just laugh at you now because everybody promises it never happens. There's no reason why it actually can't happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. David, is that what you do?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I would like to see a much clearer dividing line between who's in the government and who is not in the government. And we've got this huge penumbra around departments of sort of organisations, quangos, people like the Children's Commissioner or whatever, who are given some sort of legislative status that's kind of ambiguous, the right to be consulted. They're funded by the government. There's no obligation to support government policy or behave like they're part of the government. It's just the government has to pay, and therefore the taxpayer has to pay. And I think we should try and make it a lot clearer between who is part of the state, who is not part of the state. If you're part of the government, you should be getting behind government policy. And if you're not, you don't have to, but then you shouldn't expect taxpayers' money. And all this has got really blurred. I actually think part of the reason, it isn't the whole reason, but part of it is the model of the way the Commission worked when we're in the EU, and obviously still does work for its members, that the Commission acting as a kind of regulator and policeman for the member states, who, if they didn't have this, would try and get away with various things, as the Commissioner is the external enforcer of the law. And I think that model has kind of seeped in. So we now have absurdities like we have DEFRA, we have Department of the Environment, we have the Environment Agency, which is the kind of delivery quango agency. And then when we left the EU, we set up another regulator. I can't remember what it's called now, but it has environment in the title. But it's there to regulate the other two things. And this is just ridiculous. That agency's already been taking the government to court over things. In another example, we've got the independent monitoring authority that was set up under the withdrawal agreement to monitor how the government treats EU citizens who stayed here after Brexit. Again, that's been taking the government to court, even though it's part of the government. And this, to me, is just a nonsense. Ovenden is right about that. It has to change, but it requires a real kind of axe to be brought to the way we make government work at the moment, for sure.
Do you think there's any hope of that axe being brought without looking at the sort of necessarily the sort of what the political parties and going down that route? But the government so far, the government is making all the right noises currently about wanting to bonfire the Quangos, and they have indeed abolished NHS England. Although the abolishing of NHS England looks like it's just been consuming NHS England into the Department for Health, so maybe not entirely as far as we would like to see it. But do you think there's ever going to be a point where government has the mandate and political capital to do the sort of quite radical things that would need to be done?
Well, it did in 2019, and it conspicuously failed to do it. Not only failed to do it, but introduced lots of more ridiculous legislation, which this government, 18 months in, is still introducing football regulators and all the rest of this kind of nonsense. It can be done. It's not easy. I don't pretend it's easy. I gather Reform are working quite hard to work out exactly how they're going to be doing it if they become the government themselves. But what is relatively easy, particularly if you have a large majority, is at least amending some of this legislation, which comes up time and time again in these judicial reviews and these appeals and these court cases where the government is stopped doing what is the will of the people, the manifesto commitments very often. That I don't think is that hard. I mean, you have a political fight on your hand, obviously, because you have this shadow state is going to fight you at every turn. And a lot of the legislation itself sounds quite nice, right? Who would be against the Human Rights Act or the Equality Act? These pieces of legislation are deliberately given friendly names, but I don't think that is by any means insurmountable. And that isn't the whole battle. We do need to get rid of a huge number of these organisations and a lot of people who work for them. But it is a very large part of the battle, because then the activist judges are very limited in what they can do. There is a huge problem with activist judges, don't get me wrong. European Convention of Human Rights clearly is being misused in a way never intended by its founders. Whether leaving it or trying to get it amended is the solution, I don't know, but it has to be one of those things, because it's never been misused quite in this way before. But if you look at how it's written, it's so broad. You can see how judges can drive a coach and horses through. The right to a family life. What does it mean? Well, if you've got sensible judges, it means that the government shouldn't be splitting up families. But in the hands of an activist judge, it means that you can't deport some Albanian gangster because his son likes a certain type of fried chicken.
And I do think this point about external bodies like the Commission, the Human Rights, the ECHR, is really important. It is one of the things that's empowered lawyers within Whitehall. It's not the only thing, because lawyers are implementing their own, looking at our own domestic legislation too. But you cannot overestimate the power of lawyers within Whitehall nowadays, and Lord Hermer has obviously kind of turbocharged that in the last year. So many things don't get done because some internal lawyer says, you can't do that, Minister, it's not legal, as if that ruling is handed down from Mount Sinai rather than just being the opinion of one person. A lot of things just get squeezed out. A lot of complexity is built in, a lot of internal process happens. This is completely invisible to the wider world. So there's another big part of this problem, and of course that just empowers the wider sort of state activists as well on the back of this. The judicial review question is an important one. Judges have obviously created a bit of a doctrine of judicial review over the years that's become much, much more intrusive. But politicians have given a peg to it. They've written legislation in a way that gives all sorts of pegs for courts to have regard to this, that and the other, to check whether internal process has been done right, all this sort of thing. And, they are, many politicians, the drafters of the legislation, are co-responsible in this. They've taken an easy way out of political problems by kind of outsourcing some of the judgments.
Exactly.
And now it's coming back to bite them.
Have you, from your time in government, from being a sort of an official in the Foreign Office to a minister and a special advisor, etc., have you seen a sort of change? Has it gotten worse in that period, or has it always been something that we've struggled with?
I think it has got worse. It's always been there a bit, but I think there were different kind of how would one put it? Sort of different groups of opinion within government, within civil service. There was the lawyers, there's the economists. In the Foreign Office, you'd often have people who knew about particular kind of countries or regions. And what I remember when I first joined in my early years, there's kind of much more of an internal debate about, okay, what are we trying to do? How do we get there? What are the constraints? Whereas now, lawyers feel dominant and process feels dominant in the way decisions get taken. And
so rather than it being a sort of, this is what legal thinks, this is what the economists think, how do we get around this? It's, legal said no, therefore it's no.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly right. And a lot of that is invisible. Until you're in government, you don't realise it. And there, I sympathise a bit with Overenden on that. You don't see all that till you come in. But the general kind of aspect is very clear.
What about the structure of the departments and things? Overenden mentions about there being lots of small departments, and certainly you have lots of people complain about having to do the right man process when they're putting through legislation that basically asks all the other departments to say why they don't want this bit of legislation to happen. Do you think there's a problem of sort of stakeholder capture in individual departments as well? And is that something that one can get around?
I mean, there's a bit of Yes Minister somewhere where Bernard is explaining to Hacker how it works, and he says basically every department is being captured by the people it's supposed to be controlling.
Yeah.
And I think there's still quite a lot of truth in that your life is easier as a department if you're kind of in tune with the people you're supposed to be regulating, and it's the minister and SPADs who provide the bit of grit in the system that is easier to try and expel if you can. I think the question of machinery of government and are the departments structured right is significant, but it's a second order question really to my mind. The real problem is that there seems to be like no task the British state doesn't think it can do. It's expanded over the years, and as you would expect, it's got the more things it had to do, the worse it's got doing all those things, including what most people think of as core tasks. And that's what we're seeing. It's of diminishing returns as the state gets bigger, everything gets worse.
How much responsibility do you think the media bears for this, or the 24-hour media cycle, or whatever you want to refer to it as, for sort of giving the stakeholders in the stakeholder state a more prominent voice in shaping and defining how government acts and how government is received?
I think everything in a way has got worse since Twitter in particular came along, because so many politicians are on Twitter, and it gives politicians a very cockeyed impression of where the middle ground is, and a very exaggerated impression of how many strong opponents you have to all sorts of different things. But I just think you have to live with that, and I think that's where I do disagree with Overenden in his piece. He is moaning a lot about this people trying to put pressure on the government. Well, that's fine. You should be able to put pressure on the government, and if the government does something illegal, we should be able to take the government to court. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater here. But if you actually look at what the government has conspicuously failed to do since it came in, two obvious things spring to mind: planning reform and welfare reform. That had nothing to do with judicial reviews, as far as I know. It had nothing to do with lawyers and the civil service saying you can't do this, is illegal. It came about because of backbenchers. It wasn't even a public revolt. The welfare reform stuff was really quite popular, and the two-child benefit cap is really popular, even with Labour voters. It happened because their own backbenchers voted against it. Now, quite possibly, those backbenchers were lobbied by the Campaign for Rural England on the planning reform stuff. But that's just politics. There's nothing new about that. It's not the stakeholder state. These things have always happened. The party chose not to do these things because, even though it was basically in their manifesto, the backbenchers didn't like it. So I think he's rather passing the buck there. But that's not to say he's not right about quite a lot of things.
But it's an interesting split to make. When I was in government briefly, we used to have sort of weekly meetings with the political team, and somebody would bring a bit of analysis of what was filling up, and there'll be a pie chart of what was filling up MPs' inboxes, what the topics were, and they'd always be quite random, but it was always quite useful to know, because that's those are the things that the MPs would be more irate about, because that's just what they're seeing. But you're right that that's not necessarily a stakeholder state problem. That's just a how do you navigate political pressure problem. A part of this is presumably just having and we've mentioned it before, having the sort of bravery and ability to say no to things, and to say, actually, this isn't for us, this isn't a government focus, we want to do X, Y, Z instead. I'm sorry, but...
That's certainly true, obviously, and nobody ever says that any longer. And I'm old enough to remember Mrs. Thatcher or her ministers saying things like that on the radio in the 80s, and you hardly ever hear anybody say anything like that now. It's just completely countercultural. I mean, the problem I think this government in particular has got is that what it's trying to do is quite ambiguous to the public. It's not been elected on a really punchy set of reforms and direction of travel. It was really elected on this last lot were absolutely terrible. Surely we can be a bit better than that. And so they haven't really got a kind of political story or momentum to corral their own backbenchers and to communicate to the country, and that's politics. That's a different problem, as you're saying, Chris, from the how you manage the bureaucracy. I think they're just not very good at doing politics, and that's because they don't have a clear sense of what they actually want to do. And while that's the case, they're always going to run into difficulties.
Yeah. So what needs to happen is then for a government to be elected with a fairly clear mandate and plan for quite a radical Great Repeal Act, Chris?
I would like to see that, yes, I really would. And it'll be long and detailed, and as I say, probably more about amending than repealing. But it does need to be done. We are just buried under legislation and regulation in this country. And if even people in government are admitting that, and it's one after another now, Starmer himself has said he's found it really much more hard than his
spilled.
Yeah, Boris Johnson during the pandemic said he's pulling at levers and there seems to be nothing at the end of them. This seems to be almost a universal view of the people who are trying to get things done, is that they can't do it. So it's not just the IEA saying we need deregulation. It seems fairly obvious that we do need deregulation. The only battle is over what, in particular, regulation we get rid of. I would say anything from the last 20 years is fair game. This country was a perfectly well-functioning, in fact, a better functioning country 20 years ago before we had a lot of this stuff. Not to say none of it has any value whatsoever, but I think we need to have a good hard look at a huge amount of it.
I mean, at the end, Starmer has said, I think, only two memorable things so far, and one of those was about, and he's backed off both of them. One of them was about the civil servants being marinated in the warm bath of decline, or whatever the precise words were. He backed off from that. He identified the problem, and from as far as we know, lots of people around him think it. But he lost his nerve to keep making the point, selling it, explaining it, try and build some sort of political momentum behind doing anything about it. As soon as the civil service trade unions wrote him about it, he backed off. And so obviously you're not going to be able to change anything if that's your spirit.
He's a left-wing lawyer. He is really the worst person to have at this moment in time if that is what you want to do. It's really not in his DNA to be repealing anything.
No, totally not. Well, on that note of pessimism, that is all we've got time for, I'm afraid. Thank you very much for joining, for listening. As always, subscribe to us on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, and on Substack to get all of our stuff straight to your inbox at insider.iea.org.uk. Thanks for joining, and we will see you next time.